The vast expanse of the Zephyra Nebula shimmered in hues of violet and blue, its swirling gases stretching for light years. From the observation deck of the Velithari outpost, a lone figure stood frozen, her bioluminescent skin pulsing in slow, uncertain waves. Zira had always believed in science, in logic, in the records of her people. And those records were clear. Humans were myths, a species long whispered about in ancient tales, a ghost race that had supposedly been wiped out in the War of the Forgotten Age. No one had seen one in generations. No one even knew if they had truly existed. Yet here, in front of her disbelieving eyes, a ship was emerging from the folds of space. It was primitive compared to Velithari standards, lacking the sleek organic curves of their vessels. It was angular, industrial, covered in thick armor, as if it expected a battle. And emblazoned on its side, written in bold markings that her translator struggled to decipher, were the words, UES Valiant. Zyra's throat tightened. This wasn't possible. A chorus of frantic voices erupted behind her as the station's sensors went wild. High Counselor Zyra, unidentified vessel detected. Impossible! That design! It matches the relics! They should be extinct! Panic crackled in the air, and Zyra forced herself to breathe. Her translucent fingers hovered over the communication console, hesitating. If this was real, if humans had somehow survived, what did it mean for the Velithari, for the entire galaxy? She swallowed hard and pressed the link. Unidentified vessel, she said, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. You have entered Velithari space. State your purpose. A crackling silence followed. The station's energy field fluctuated, flickering in response to the ship's presence. Then, with a harsh burst of static, a voice, gritty, raw, undeniably alien to her ears, came through. This is Captain Elias Kane of the United Earthship Valiant. A pause. We come in peace. Zira's pulse spiked. Humans weren't just myths. They were real, and they were back. Zyra's mind raced, her bioluminescent skin pulsing with a rapid rhythm that betrayed her inner turmoil. The station's command room buzzed with an intensity she hadn't felt in her lifetime. Scientists, tacticians, and diplomatic officers whispered among themselves, their voices a mix of disbelief and caution. The transmission hung in the air like a heavy weight. A human, a real, breathing human, had just spoken to her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Captain Kane, your presence here is unexpected. Understatement of the cycle. There are no known records of human vessels in this sector, or anywhere. A beat of silence. Then Kane's voice crackled back. That's because we weren't in this sector. We've been lost for a long time. Zira narrowed her eyes, scanning the ship's readings. Their technology was crude, inefficient by Velithari standards, but it was still intact, functional. How had a ship so primitive survived? And if they were lost, from where? She turned to the defense officer beside her. Are there any signs of aggression? No, High Counselor, the officer replied. Their weapons are powered down. Their energy signatures suggest they've been running on minimal reserves. If anything, they look desperate. Desperate. Zyra exhaled slowly. She turned back to the communication link. You claim to be lost, Captain. Where exactly have you been? Another pause. Then, Kane spoke again, but this time his voice was different. It carried something weary, something haunted. We don't know. The command center fell into silence. Zira's gaze flickered to the ship, hanging in the vast blackness beyond the station's protective field. Something about the way it just sat there, unmoving, waiting, sent a strange chill through her. She pressed forward. Clarify, Kane sighed. We left Earth 200 years ago on a deep space colonization mission. We were meant to find a new home, but something happened. A distortion, a tear in space. We fell through it and... He hesitated, as if trying to grasp memories that didn't fit together. We woke up somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. Zyra's fingers curled against the console. You're saying you traveled through an anomaly? Yes, Kane said, his voice grim. And we weren't alone. The lights flickered. A murmur ran through the control room. Zyra stiffened. What do you mean? She asked carefully. Kane hesitated again, but when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was something else in the dark with us. The words sent a ripple of unease through the Velithari officers. Zyra felt it too, a deep, instinctual warning coiling in her chest. The myths had been wrong. Humans weren't just legends. They were survivors. And something had followed them. Zyra's skin dimmed to a muted blue, the color of unease. Around her, the command center felt too quiet, as if even the hum of the station's energy field had dulled in response to Captain Kane's ominous words. Something else had been in the dark with them. She didn't like the way that sounded. Her mind worked quickly, sorting through possibilities. The Velithari had encountered anomalies before. Unstable wormholes, spatial rifts, regions where time itself frayed at the edges. But a ship lost for 200 years? That wasn't just a malfunction or a navigational error. That was something else. She straightened. Captain Kane, are you saying your ship was pursued? A static-laced sigh came through the transmission. I don't know if pursued is the right word. A pause. But we weren't alone in that place, and we barely made it out. Zyra exchanged a glance with her defense officer, whose mandibles clicked softly in thought. Then what was there? She asked. There was a long silence before Kane spoke again. I can't describe it, he admitted. It wasn't something we could see exactly, more like a presence, something watching, studying us. At first we thought it was our imaginations, space madness, paranoia, but then the disappearances started. A cold weight settled in Zyra's chest. Disappearances? Kane's voice turned grim. One by one, my crew started vanishing. No alarms, no signs of struggle. They'd be there one moment and then gone. Zyra's breath hitched. Even the Velithari, with all their advancements, had no technology capable of something like that. This was beyond mere war or survival. This was something unknown. And you never saw it? She pressed. No, Kane admitted. But we felt it. Every shadow seemed longer than it should be. Every corridor stretched just a little too far. The air was wrong. His voice wavered slightly, as if recalling something too large, too vast for comprehension. Then we heard the whispers. Zyra's skin turned pale. Behind her, one of her officers sucked in a sharp breath. Velithari were a species deeply attuned to sound, to vibrations in space and matter. The idea of hearing something in the void, a place where sound did not exist, was horrifying. Whispers, she echoed. Kane exhaled slowly. We didn't understand the language, but we felt what it meant. Hunger, curiosity, amusement. The command room remained deathly silent. And then? Zyra finally asked. Kane hesitated. And then we saw the door. Zyra's fingers curled against the console. What door? The one that shouldn't have been there, Kane said. His voice was quieter now, almost as if speaking the words aloud would bring it back. It wasn't part of the ship. It wasn't real. And yet we all saw it. A black doorway at the end of the corridor where there should have been a bulkhead. His next words sent a shiver through Zyra's very core. And it was open. A pulse of alarm ran through the command center. Zyra forced herself to focus. "Did you go through it?" "No," Kane said, "but something else did." The station's lights flickered again. Zyra's mouth went dry. "And is it still with you now?" The silence on the other end of the transmission was too long, too heavy. Then Kane answered. "I don't know." The lights flickered again. This time they didn't come back on right away. And deep in the station's long, empty corridors, something shifted. For the first time in her life, Zyra felt truly cold. The station's emergency lights flickered back on, casting everything in a dim, pulsing glow. The command center's screens struggled to recalibrate, and Zyra's officers exchanged uneasy glances. Velithari technology didn't glitch. Their systems were built to withstand solar flares, spatial distortions, even direct attacks. So why did it feel like something had touched them? She forced herself to focus. "Captain Kane, if you don't know whether it's still with you, then how did you escape?" Kane hesitated. Then, "We didn't escape. We were let go." Zyra stiffened. "It happened all at once," he continued, his voice grim. "The ship was falling apart, half my crew was gone, and then..." The whispers stopped. The door closed, and suddenly we were back in real space, drifting in open void. Zyra's mind reeled. That didn't make sense. No natural anomaly behaved like that. No entity, if that's what it was, simply released prey after hunting them. Unless it got what it wanted, she murmured. A tense silence stretched between them. Kane exhaled. "That's what I've been afraid of." Zyra glanced at her officers, whose expressions ranged from skepticism to thinly veiled fear. Her second-in-command, Rylith, finally stepped forward. "High Counselor, we must consider the possibility that this human ship is compromised." "I know," she said softly. Kane must have heard, because his voice hardened. "Listen, I don't know what followed us, and I don't know if we left it behind. But I do know one thing. We need help." Zyra considered that. Helping a myth come to life was dangerous enough. Helping a myth that had been touched by something unknown? That was reckless. But there was something else, something she hadn't admitted aloud yet. The Velithari were an ancient race, explorers of the cosmos long before most species had even discovered fire. But never, not once in all their recorded history, had they encountered something like this. Whatever had taken Kane's crew, whatever had watched them, it was new, and that terrified her. She turned to her officers. "Prepare an isolation bay, no direct interface with their systems, no unnecessary contact." A murmur of protest rippled through the room, but she silenced it with a sharp look. "We do not turn away survivors, but we will take every precaution." Rylith exhaled, then nodded. "Understood." Zyra turned back to the transmission. "Captain Kane, you are permitted to dock under strict quarantine. You and your crew will be subject to scans before disembarkation." Kane didn't argue. That, more than anything, unsettled her. The human ship drifted closer, its hulking, battered form casting long shadows against the nebula's light. Zyra watched it, unease curling in her chest. Had she just made a terrible mistake? Then, deep within the station, a security feed flickered. For exactly 0.7 seconds, an empty corridor showed a door that wasn't there before, and then it was gone. The Valiant docked with an uneasy groan, metal straining against the station's pressurized airlocks. The sound sent a shiver through Zyra, though she masked it well. The Velithari were not an easily frightened people, but something about them, felt wrong. She stood in the quarantine bay, a sterile, reinforced chamber designed to process travelers from unknown regions. A shimmering containment field separated her and her officers from the approaching humans. The doors hissed open. 3 figures stepped through. Zyra had seen humans in ancient recordings, but seeing them in the flesh was different. They were taller than she expected, broader, their limbs dense with muscle. Their features were rough, their skin bearing signs of hardship, creases, scars, the wear of time. They lacked the natural bioluminescence of the Velithari, their eyes dark and unreadable. Captain Elias Kane stood at the front, his face lined with exhaustion. Behind him, a woman with short, dark hair kept her hand near her belt, where Zira assumed a weapon had once been holstered. The third, a younger man, looked around the room with wide, wary eyes, as if unsure whether to trust what he was seeing. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Zira broke the silence. "Welcome to Velithari space." Kane's gaze flicked to her, studying her in that sharp, unreadable way humans seemed to do. "Appreciate the hospitality," he said, voice rough. "Not that we had many options." Zira ignored the bitterness in his tone. "You and your crew will undergo a full bioscan. No exceptions." Kane didn't argue. He only nodded. "Fine." The energy field shimmered, scanning them with an iridescent glow. Zyra watched the readings carefully. Then something strange happened. The scanner hesitated. Zira's breath hitched. That wasn't possible. The system was designed to process every known biological signature in the galaxy, to detect inconsistencies, foreign matter, anomalies. The scan wasn't failing. It was trying to read something it didn't recognize. Her second-in-command, Rilith, frowned at the display. "High Counselor, their readings are distorted." Kane tensed. "What does that mean?" Zyra met his gaze. "It means there's something inside you that shouldn't be." The woman at Kane's side tensed. "We're clean," she snapped. "We wouldn't have survived this long if we weren't." Rylith shook his head. "The scanner says otherwise." Kane took a slow breath, and for the first time, Zyra saw it. That flicker of fear behind his carefully controlled expression. "What exactly?" he said, voice quiet. "Is it detecting?" Zyra hesitated. "I don't know." The room fell into silence. Then the lights flickered. Every officer in the bay stiffened, hands reaching for weapons, scanning displays, searching for a cause. Zira's pulse quickened. Then the young human, the quiet one, gasped. Zira turned just in time to see his eyes widen in pure, unfiltered terror. "There," he whispered, voice shaking. "By the door." Everyone spun. There was nothing there, just empty space, but the human's breathing was ragged, his body trembling. "You don't see it?" he choked out. Zira's blood turned cold. The young man backed up, his face pale. "The door," he whispered. "It's here." The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. Darkness swallowed the quarantine bay. For one breathless moment there was nothing. No light, no sound, just the deep, suffocating quiet of space pressing in around them. Then, the emergency backup system hummed to life, dim red lights flickering on, casting long, jagged shadows against the metallic walls. Zyra's bioluminescence pulsed erratically, an unconscious response to danger. Her officers stood rigid, weapons drawn, scanning for threats they couldn't yet see. The humans, however, stood completely still. The young one, the one who had seen something, was shaking. His breath came fast, shallow. His eyes darted wildly around the room. "The door," he whispered again, voice hoarse. "It's still here." Zyra's throat tightened. "There is nothing there," Rylith snapped, though his mandibles twitched with unease. Our scanners show they don't see it, the young man gasped, stepping back. They never see it. Zyra felt the air shift, just slightly, a strange pressure, a subtle pull, as if something unseen had just passed too close. The station's artificial gravity flickered, a barely perceptible glitch, but she felt it. Kane exhaled slowly. We need to leave this room. Zyra turned to him. Explain. You wanted to know how we survived? Kane said, his voice low, measured. We never stayed in one place for too long. Something about the way he said it made Zyra's pulse spike. We move, Kane continued, his jaw clenched. We never acknowledge it, and we never stop. A heavy silence followed his words. Then, from the far corner of the room, something creaked. Zyra didn't move. Neither did anyone else, but she felt it, a presence. Not a being, not something that could be identified by logic or science, just a feeling. A whisper against her mind, a cold breath against the fabric of reality itself. Her officers shifted uneasily. One of them, Tyvan, glanced toward the darkened corner where nothing should have been. His hand twitched toward his weapon. And then, the shadows moved, not a trick of the failing lights, not a malfunction of their systems. The darkness itself shifted. Tyvan screamed. Zyra didn't hesitate. Out, now! The quarantine bay doors hissed open, and they ran. Zyra didn't look back. She didn't have to. The humans ran ahead of them, leading the way as if they knew the station better than she did. Behind them, the lights flickered again. The shadows stretched. And in the echoing silence, Zyra thought she heard something. A whisper. Software indistinct. Laughing. They reached the emergency corridor, the doors sealing behind them with a heavy clang. Zyra whirled on Kane. What in the name of the stars is following you? Kane's face was pale, his breaths coming fast. I told you, he said hoarsely. We don't know. The young man leaned against the wall, hands gripping his head. It's inside, he muttered. It followed us. It always follows. Zyra clenched her jaw. This was no longer just about the humans. Something had entered her station. And it wasn't planning to leave. The emergency corridor stretched before them, dimly lit by the flickering red lights. Zyra could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, but she forced herself to stay focused. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Her officers were tense, weapons drawn, scanning the hallways for threats they couldn't see. The humans were worse, silent, rigid, their eyes darting toward every shadow as if expecting them to move. She had seen fear before. This was different. This was the kind of fear that came from knowing. Zyra turned sharply to Kane. Tell me everything. Kane wiped a hand over his face. His skin was damp with sweat. It started small, lights flickering, strange sounds in the comms, people reporting dreams they swore weren't their own. He exhaled, shaking his head. Then the disappearances started, one by one. No alarms, no signs of struggle. They just vanished. Zyra's throat tightened. And this door you saw? It appeared in different places, Kane said, his voice low. Always where it shouldn't be. At first we thought it was just a malfunction in the ship's layout. But when people started disappearing near it... He stopped himself, exhaling shakily. We knew it wasn't part of the Valiant. It wasn't ours. Zyra's mind raced. Could this be some kind of unknown life form? An entity that fed off perception, warping reality itself? Or was it something worse? Something that existed outside their understanding? The young human, Adams, she thought Kane had called him, was still gripping his head, his breathing shallow. It's here, he whispered. I can feel it. Zyra's second-in-command, Rylith, snarled. Enough. We are Velithari. We do not cower from unseen things. This is... The lights cut out. The entire station plunged into absolute blackness. The hum of the emergency power faltered, then stilled. The air itself felt heavier, as if something unseen had pressed its weight against reality. Then Zira heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, like a door opening. She held her breath. The sound came again, closer, a faint whisper of metal bending, a hollow stretch of space being altered. Then, from somewhere just ahead of them, a voice. Software, amused. "Found you!" A scream erupted. Someone fired a weapon, the bright flash illuminating the corridor for a fraction of a second. And in that second, Zira saw it. A door, blacker than space itself, wide open, and beyond it, nothing. No walls, no corridors, no station, just endless, yawning void. Then the lights flickered back, and Adams was gone. Zira gasped. Kane's face twisted in horror. "No, no, Adams!" He lunged forward, but Zira grabbed him, yanking him back. "He's gone!" Kane struggled, but then, just as quickly, he froze. Zira followed his gaze. The door was gone. Nothing remained of it. No mark, no distortion. Just the empty corridor, as if it had never been there at all. Her officers stood rigid, staring at the spot where the young human had vanished. Zira turned to Kane, her voice sharp. "How do we stop this?" Kane's face was pale. "You don't," he whispered. "You run." Zira's mind raced. The weight of Adam's disappearance pressed down on her like a physical force, but there was no time to grieve. The air in the corridor felt wrong. Thicker, colder, charged with something she couldn't name. She tightened her grip on Kane's arm, forcing him to meet her gaze. "We don't run. This is my station, my people. We fight." Kane let out a bitter laugh. "You think we didn't try that?" His eyes were wild, desperate. "We fired weapons at it. We sealed doors. We vented entire sections of our ship into space. It didn't care. It doesn't follow rules. It doesn't have form. It's just there." Zira clenched her jaw. She had faced threats before. Entire war fleets. Civilizations that crumbled under Velithari's strategy. But this wasn't something that could be reasoned with. Rilith spoke, voice tight. "Then why you? Why your ship? Why did it take Adams and not you?" Kane swallowed hard. "I don't know." But Zira caught the way his hand twitched, the flicker of something, guilt that passed over his face. He did know, or at least he suspected. She didn't press, not yet. "We need to get to the command center," she said. "If we can isolate the affected areas, cut them off from the rest of the station, we might be able to contain this thing." Kane shook his head. "You don't contain it." Rylith scowled. "We are not helpless." Kane exhaled sharply. "I'm not saying you're helpless. I'm saying you don't understand what you're dealing with." His jaw clenched. "You're treating this like an enemy. It's not. It's something else. And if you keep thinking you can beat it, you're going to get more people killed." Zira didn't respond right away. She didn't like how much truth there was in his words, but surrendering wasn't an option. She turned to her officers. "Move. We get to the command center now." They started down the corridor at a quickened pace. Kane and his remaining crew followed, their eyes constantly flickering to the shadows. The station felt wrong now, as if something was watching, waiting. A soft thump echoed behind them. Zira froze. Another thump, closer this time. Everyone turned. The corridor was empty. Then, the lights flickered. Zira barely had time to react before something changed. The walls stretched. The floor beneath her shifted like it was warping under her feet. And suddenly, the corridor ahead of them was different. The sleek, familiar architecture of the Velithari station was gone. In its place was something older, rusted, familiar. Kane let out a strangled breath. Oh no. Zyra followed his gaze and saw that the corridor now led to the interior of the Valiant, the human ship. But that wasn't possible. They were still on the station. The Valiant was docked outside. This couldn't be real. Zyra turned sharply to Kane. What is this? Kane's face was pale. His breaths came too fast. This is where it started. The young woman at his side, Reyes, looked even worse. No, she whispered. We left this place behind. We left it. Zyra felt the walls tightening, reality shifting around them. They weren't on the station anymore. Or maybe the station was becoming something else. Then, from the far end of the impossible hallway, Zyra saw it. The door. Not a normal door. It was wrong. Pitch black. Seething. And this time it wasn't just open. Something was stepping out. The world felt thin. Zyra could barely breathe. The air around her warped, rippled, like heat waves rising from a dying star. But it wasn't heat. If anything, it was cold. The kind of cold that didn't just freeze skin but reached inside and pulled. The door at the far end of the corridor yawned open, impossibly dark, its surface shifting like liquid void. The shape that emerged from it wasn't right. It wasn't anything. There were no edges to define it, no features to name. It wasn't a figure, wasn't a shadow. It was absence, a hollow space where something should have been. And yet, Zyra felt it looking at them. A deep, slow awareness that pressed against her mind like a whispered breath at the nape of her neck. She took an instinctive step back. So did her officers. But the humans, Kane, Reyes, stood frozen, their eyes wide with recognition. They had seen this before. Reyes trembled, whispering, "It's not supposed to be here." But it was. And it wasn't leaving. Zyra reached for her communicator. "This is High Counselor Zyra. Emergency lockdown. Seal all corridors and sector." The signal cut out. The walls groaned. The metal of the station shuddered, the same way the hull of a ship might under pressure from deep space. Zyra could feel it now. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just inside the station. It was becoming the station. She turned to Kane. "If we run, will it follow?" Kane tore his eyes from the door. His breathing was shallow. "No." Zyra narrowed her gaze. "You don't sound sure." Kane swallowed hard. "It doesn't need to follow." Zyra's stomach twisted. "Then what does it do?" Reyes answered instead, her voice hollow. "It waits." And as she said it, the door began to change. The black surface rippled, shifting. It grew, its edges stretching outward, like it was bleeding into the walls themselves. And for the first time, Zyra saw something inside it. She thought it was just shadows at first. But then the shapes moved. Hands reaching out, thousands of them. Thin, grasping fingers clawing at the air, stretching toward the corridor as if trying to pull it in. The lights flickered. Then every single hand snapped toward them. Zyra didn't hesitate. "Run!" They bolted. The station trembled around them, the metal beneath their feet wrong, too smooth, too cold. Zyra's mind reeled. This wasn't just an entity. It wasn't just an anomaly. It was changing the station itself. She could hear something behind them. Not footsteps, not movement. A dragging sound, like the weight of something pulling reality apart. They turned a corner and almost slammed into a dead end. No, this wasn't here before," Rylith shouted. Zyra spun, heart hammering. Behind them, the corridor was gone. In its place, the door, closer now, the hands stretching toward them, the whispering louder. Reyes let out a sob. Kane's face was pale, his fingers twitching toward his belt where a weapon should have been. Zyra's officers stood rigid, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about not being erased. Zira gritted her teeth. Number, she wouldn't let this happen. Not to her people, not to her station. She turned to Kane. There has to be a way to stop this. Kane hesitated. Then, with a look of pure desperation, he whispered, There's only one thing we ever tried that worked. Zira's voice was sharp. What? Kane's eyes locked onto hers. You have to close the door. And then, the whispering turned into screaming. The scream wasn't sound. It was something deeper. It tore through the air, through the walls, through them. Zira felt it in her bones, in the marrow of her being, a shriek that had no voice but carried meaning. Don't close the door. She stumbled back, clutching her head, as if she could shake the feeling loose. Around her, her officers convulsed, their bioluminescence flickering in erratic pulses. Reyes was on her knees, hands over her ears. Even Kane, the hardened survivor, had gone pale, his breath ragged. But Zira forced herself to move. If the entity didn't want the door closed, then closing it was the only option. She staggered forward, toward the writhing black mass that shouldn't exist, the hands still reaching, clawing for purchase. The shape of the door was fluid, shifting, its edges dripping into the walls of the station like ink dissolving into water. It wasn't just here. It was spreading. How? She shouted, forcing her voice over the unnatural scream. How do we close it? Kane gritted his teeth. We tried before. It doesn't want to shut. You have to force it. Rip it from this place. Make it let go. Zira's pulse pounded. The station was Velithari technology, far beyond human understanding. If the entity was tied to this space, she needed to sever its connection. She turned sharply. Rylith, override the station's gravitational field, now! Her second-in-command's eyes widened. That could crush us all. Zira didn't flinch. It's that, or we let it take us. Rylith hesitated only a second before sprinting to the nearest control panel. His fingers danced across the interface, inputting emergency override commands. The station groaned. A deep, mechanical whine filled the corridor. The artificial gravity buckled. Zira felt her body shift, her feet lifting slightly, as if something beneath her was breaking. The metal warped, the walls twisting under an unseen strain. The entity screamed in response, its many hands flailing wildly, as if sensing the sudden imbalance. The door flickered, its edges wavered. It was losing its hold. Kane grabbed Reyes by the arm, hauling her up. It's working! Keep going! Zira turned to Rylith. Increase the field oscillation. Disrupt it completely. Rylith's mandibles clicked in distress, but he obeyed. A violent tremor shook the station. The door convulsed, its form glitching, as if reality itself was trying to reject it. The hands reaching from the void began to break apart. The whispers turned to screeches. And then, the door slammed shut. A shockwave blasted outward, sending Zira and the others sprawling. The station's lights flickered wildly, alarms blaring in overlapping chaos. The air felt thin, stretched, as if something immense had just been ripped away. Then, silence. Zira lay on her back, gasping for breath. The metal beneath her felt solid again. The world had stopped warping. The oppressive weight, the feeling of being watched, was gone. Slowly, she pushed herself up. The door was gone. No trace, no disturbance, no lingering shadows. Just an empty corridor. Her people, what remained of them, began to stir. Kane groaned, rubbing his head. Reyes sat up, looking around in dazed confusion. Zira swallowed hard. Is it over? No one answered, because there was no way to know. The station still felt different. And Adams was still gone. Kane sat up, his expression hollow. He met Zira's gaze, something dark lingering in his eyes. "It's never over," he muttered. Zira didn't want to believe him, but deep in the station's core, in a place no one was looking, a new door flickered into existence. And this time, it wasn't open. Not yet.